The chill in the house had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a deeper cold, one that seeped from the walls and settled in the spaces between people, a frost that no amount of sunlight through the tall windows could ever hope to thaw. For 16-year-old Lily, waking up was not a gentle return to consciousness, but a reluctant submission to this daily reality. Her room, a sanctuary in shades of faded lavender, felt like the only place where the air was still, where the silence wasn't accusatory. Downstairs, the scent of coffee and toasted bread should have been comforting, but it was just another reminder of the division within the home. Elena, her stepmother, was already at the kitchen counter, her posture as rigid and unyielding as her expression. She did not look up as Lily entered, her focus entirely on the newspaper spread before her, a fortress of black and white text. Lily moved quietly to the cupboard, her stomach a hollow ache, but before her fingers could reach. Against a cereal box, Eleanor's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, and precise. She commented not on the hour, nor on a greeting, but on the slight slump of Lily's shoulders, a criticism as habitual as the dawn. The words were a familiar sting, a reminder that her very presence was a flaw to be corrected. The promised breakfast was withheld with a silent, pointed glance towards the empty chair at the table, a punishment for some unnamed transgression that Lily had likely committed simply by being her mother's daughter. When David, her father, hurried into the kitchen, his tie still loose and his mind clearly already miles away at the office, the dynamic solidified. He offered a distracted smile, a ghost of paternal affection, before diving into a conversation with Elena about a missed call from a client. He was a kind man, but his kindness was diluted by a perpetual preoccupation, making him a spectator in his own home. He poured his coffee, kissed Eleanor's cheek, and ruffled Lily's hair in a single, fluid motion that felt more like a checklist than a connection. He failed to see the tight line of his wife's mouth or the way his daughter's eyes followed her, hoping for a moment of true recognition that never came. As her father departed, the sound of the closing front door echoed like a verdict in the suddenly still house. Lily was left alone with Elena, the space between them vast and frigid. She felt the weight of her isolation press down on her, a physical force. In these quiet, cold moments, the house felt less like a home and more like a beautifully furnished cage, and she was the lone occupant, misunderstood and utterly, profoundly unloved. The pain was a quiet, constant hum beneath her skin, the prologue to a story of hidden sorrows no one seemed willing to read. Punishment in Eleanor's house was never loud or violent. It was a quiet, calculated affair, designed to instill a sense of uselessness and isolation. That afternoon, the sentence was the attic. Single, cobweb-draped light bulbs swung from a beam, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock Lily's presence. The air was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things, a dry, ancient scent that coated the back of her throat. Eleanor had handed her a dust cloth and a vacuum with a cord that was frayed with age, her instructions delivered in a tone of cold finality. This was to be her penance for the crime of existing too loudly, for taking up too much space in a house that no longer felt like her own. The task was monumental, a sea of shrouded furniture and stacked boxes that stretched into the gloom. Lily worked mechanically, her movements stirring up clouds of dust that glittered in the slivers of light cutting through the grimy circular window. She wiped down an old dressmaker's dummy, its form eerily human, and pushed aside a crate of her father's old law textbooks, their bindings cracked and brittle. It was behind this crate, tucked into a dark corner as if deliberately hidden, that her fingers brushed against the spine of a large, leather-bound book. Pulling it free, she sank onto an old horsehair-stuffed trunk, the album heavy in her lap. The cover was embossed with a faded floral pattern, the leather soft and cracked with age. With a sense of reverence that felt out of place in the neglectful attic, she opened it. The first pages held the stiff, formal portraits of people she did not know, their faces stern and unsmiling. But as she turned the page, her breath caught. There they were, young and vibrant, their faces illuminated by a sun that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Her mother, Sarah, beamed at the camera, her hair a wild, sun-kissed cascade, her arm thrown casually around the shoulders of a young Elena. Eleanor's face in these photographs was a revelation. It was open, her smile genuine and easy, her eyes crinkled at the corners with laughter. They were perched on a low stone wall, surrounded by a blur of them. Two young women bound by a friendship that seemed unbreakable. Lily traced the outline of her mother's face, a familiar yet distant ghost, her heart aching with a loss that was both profound and confusing. She turned another page, and the narrative of the photographs shifted. The poses became more formal, the settings more domestic. And then she found it. A single photograph, tucked into the bottom corner of the page, captured a moment of profound tension. It was taken in what looked like a garden, Sarah and Elena standing a few feet apart. Sarah's smile was strained, her eyes shadowed with something that looked like sorrow. Eleanor's expression was harder, her jaw set, her gaze fixed on something just beyond the camera's frame. The easy camaraderie was gone, replaced by a chasm of unspoken words. This was a fracture captured in sepia tones. The creak of the attic stairs was her only warning. Before she could react, a shadow fell over the album. Alina stood over her, her face a pale, rigid mask in the dim light. Her eyes, usually so cold and controlled, held a flash of pure, undiluted anger. Without a word, she snatched the album from Lily's lap, her grip so tight her knuckles turned white. The air, already thick with dust, now crackled with a new, dangerous energy. Alina's gaze dropped to the open page, to that single, damning photograph, and for a terrifying second, Lily saw something raw and panicked flicker in her stepmother's eyes before the familiar wall of ice slammed back into place. "This is not for you," Alina said, her voice a low, venomous whisper. She clutched the album to her chest as if it were a stolen child, turned on her heel, and descended the stairs, leaving Lily alone in the dusty silence. The mystery, once a vague, haunting feeling, had now taken a tangible, photographic form, and the anger in Alina's eyes had deepened it into something urgent and terrifying. Dinner that evening was a carefully constructed performance of normalcy. A fragile stage play where every prop was in its place and every line was rehearsed. The polished mahogany table gleamed under the warm glow of the chandelier, reflecting the silver and the delicate china. The food, a perfectly roasted chicken with herbs and buttery potatoes, steamed in the center, its savory aroma failing to cut through the tension that had followed Alina down from the attic. Lily pushed a piece of potato around her plate, the image of the two young women, one her mother, one her tormentor, burned onto the back of her eyelids. The weight of the unasked question felt heavier than any meal. She waited for a lull, a moment when her father, David, was between bites, his attention momentarily unclaimed by his food or his thoughts of work. Taking a quiet breath, she looked directly at him, her voice deliberately soft. She asked about Sarah. Not about how she died, not about the sadness, but about the woman in the photograph. Her laugh, her favorite color, the sound of her voice. For a single, heart-stopping second, a profound and gentle sorrow softened her father's features, his eyes losing their distant focus as if seeing a beloved ghost. Then the moment shattered. The shutters came down behind his eyes with an almost audible click. He cleared his throat, his gaze dropping to his plate as he meticulously cut a piece of chicken. His response was a masterclass in evasion, a bland murmur about the past being the past and some memories being too private to share. He swiftly steered the conversation toward the safe, sterile harbor of Lily's schoolwork, asking about a math test with a forced cheerfulness that was more painful than silence. Across the table, Alina's posture, already rigid, became statue-like, her knife and fork held in a white-knuckled grip. She did not look at Lily, but her silent approval of David's deflection was a palpable force in the room. Later, the house settled into the deep quiet of the night. Lily, unable to sleep, crept downstairs for a glass of water. The moon cast long, silver blades of light across the floorboards. As she approached the kitchen, she heard the low, urgent murmur of voices from her father's study. The door was ajar just a crack. She froze, pressing herself against the cool wall, her own breath held captive in her chest. It was Alina's voice, a strained, desperate whisper that carried a weight the daytime version of her never did. "We have to leave it be, David. We agreed, for everyone's sake." There was a pause, and then the words that would echo in Lily's mind for days to come, each syllable dripping with a fear she had never imagined Alina could possess. "We have to bury the past, for good." There was no response from her father, only a heavy, resigned silence that was an answer in itself. The conversation ended, the soft sound of a door closing signaling Alina's exit. Lily remained in the shadows, the cold from the wall seeping into her skin. Bury the past, the words were not just a plea, they were a confession. They were an admission that there was something to bury, something significant and terrible that they had both conspired to hide. The evasiveness at dinner, the anger in the attic, and now this whispered conspiracy, it all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. Her family's history was a locked room, and she had just been handed the first crucial clue to finding the key. The quiet determination that rose within her was fiercer than any hunger, a resolve to dig up every last secret they had tried so hard to inter. The whispered words, "bury the past," became a relentless mantra in Lily's mind, a ghost that haunted the quiet spaces of the house and turned every glance from Alina into a potential clue. The attic's dust still felt gritty under her fingernails, a tangible reminder of the hidden album and the fractured friendship it revealed. Her father's evasiveness and her stepmother's simmering anger were no longer just sources of pain. They were signposts pointing toward a hidden truth. The cold neglect she endured was no longer a random cruelty, but likely a symptom of a deeper, older wound, and she was determined to find its source. Alone in her room, with the door securely locked, she opened her laptop. The blue glow of the screen illuminated her face in the dim afternoon light. She started with simple, broad searches: Sarah and David with their town's name. The results were a digital graveyard of mundane records and outdated social media profiles that led nowhere. She tried adding Aliner's name to the search, but the internet yielded nothing about their shared past. Frustration began to prickle at her, the vastness of the web feeling like another locked door. Then, she remembered the raw, panicked look in Aliner's eyes in the attic. It was the look of someone terrified of a specific memory. She typed in house fire alongside her town's name and a range of years spanning her early childhood, pages of irrelevant. News stories and community announcements scrolled by. She was about to give up when a link from a digitized archive of the local paper, now defunct, caught her eye. The headline was brief and uninformative. Blaze claims historic home on Elm Street. The date was just a few months before her mother's death. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she clicked. The article was frustratingly vague, a few short paragraphs detailing the fire's intensity and the tragic loss of the property, a Victorian home known for its intricate gingerbread trim. There were no mentions of injuries, no names of residents, just a sterile report of an event. But it was the date, a ghost from her earliest, foggiest memories, and the location, a street she sometimes walked down, that felt significant. It was a thread, thin and fragile, but it was something Aliner and David had not been able to erase from the public record. The article was a start, but it was not enough. She needed a voice from that time. Someone who had witnessed the lives behind the headlines. The answer came in the form of Mrs. Gable, their elderly next-door neighbor who had lived on the street for 50 years and was often found tending her rose bushes, a silent witness to the neighborhood's changing tides. Seizing an opportunity one breezy afternoon, Lily approached the low hedge that separated their properties. Mrs. Gable was pruning a climbing rose, her hands, gloved in thick leather, moving with practiced ease. Lily made small talk about the flowers, their scent thick and sweet in the air, before carefully steering the conversation toward the past. She mentioned finding an old photo of her mother and Aliner together, looking like the best of friends. Mrs. Gable paused, her shears stilling. A shadow passed over her wrinkled, kind face, and she looked toward Lily's house with a distant, sorrowful expression. She confirmed that yes, Sarah and Aliner had been inseparable once, two bright young women whose laughter used to fill both their houses. They had been like sisters, she murmured, her voice softening with the memory. But then her tone shifted, growing cautious and heavy. Something happened though, she said, shaking her head slowly. A falling out. It was around the time of that terrible fire a few streets over. After that, everything changed. She wouldn't elaborate further, suddenly becoming very busy with a stubborn knot in a rose stem, her body language closing off. Some rifts, she said, not meeting Lily's eyes, run too deep to ever truly mend. And some secrets, well, they have a weight to them, a terrible weight. Lily returned to her room, Mrs. Gable's words echoing the cryptic warning from the study. The pieces were still scattered, but a clearer picture was beginning to form. A close friendship, a devastating fire, a bitter rift, and a secret so heavy it had twisted Aliner's love into harshness and her father's grief into neglect. The hidden betrayal was no longer just an abstract concept. It was a specific event, tied to flames and a broken bond, and Lily knew she was getting closer to the heart of the coldness that had defined her life. The locket felt like a live coal in Lily's palm, its delicate silver chain coiled around her fingers. She had found it tucked inside a forgotten jewelry box at the back of her own closet, a final, overlooked relic of her mother's. It was cool to the touch, but the secret it held seemed to radiate a feverish heat. For days she carried it with her, the weight of it a constant, burning question. Mrs. Gable's words about a terrible rift and the vague news article about the fire had fused in her mind with the strained photograph from the attic, creating a pressure that demanded release. She could no longer live in the shadow of their buried past. She had to force it into the light. She chose a moment when her father was still at work, when the house was steeped in the quiet tension of a late afternoon. Aliner was in the living room, meticulously arranging a vase of white lilies, her movements sharp and efficient. The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the floor, painting the room in hues of gold and deep violet. Lily stood in the doorway for a long moment, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, gathering the courage to shatter the fragile piece. She stepped into the room, the polished floorboards silent beneath her feet. Aliner did not turn, her attention fixed on the perfect symmetry of her floral arrangement. Lily's voice, when it came, was quieter than she intended, barely a whisper that nonetheless seemed to suck all the sound from the room. She called Aliner's name, and when her stepmother finally turned, her expression was one of mild, impatient inquiry. That was when Lily opened her hand, the small, oval locket gleaming in the dusky light. She clicked the tiny clasp. The locket sprang open, revealing its hidden heart. On one side was a tiny, faded photograph of Sarah. Her smile gentle and her eyes full of a light Lily could only remember in dreams. On the other side was a man. He was handsome, with dark, smiling eyes, but he was not David. He was a stranger, his arm wrapped comfortably around Sarah's shoulders in the intimate way of a close friend or something more. The change in Aliner was instantaneous and terrifying. It was not the cold, controlled anger Lily was accustomed to. It was a volcanic eruption of pure, unadulterated rage. All the color drained from her face, only to flood back in two bright, ugly spots on her cheeks. Her eyes, usually so distant, widened with a shock so profound it looked like physical pain, quickly consumed by a blazing fury. She snatched the locket from Lily's hand with a violence that made the chain bite into Lily's skin. Her voice was a guttural, choked thing, stripped of all its cultured composure. She did not ask where Lily had found it. She did not explain the photograph. Instead, she unleashed a torrent of accusations, her words sharp and venomous. She called Lily a troublemaker, a meddler, a ghost sent to torment her. She spat that Lily was digging up graves best left untouched, that her prying would only bring ruin upon them all. Each word was a lash, meant to wound and intimidate. Then, with a cry of raw, furious anguish, Alina slammed the locket onto the marble mantelpiece. The delicate silver gave way with a sickening crunch. She brought her hand down again and again, the sound a series of sharp, final cracks. When she finally stilled, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the locket was a ruined twist of metal, the tiny photographs obliterated into meaningless fragments. She swept the broken pieces into her palm and hurled them into the cold fireplace, where they disappeared into the gray ash. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. Alina stood trembling, her chest heaving, her knuckles white where they gripped the mantel for support. The carefully arranged lilies seemed to wilt in their vase, their pristine beauty a stark contrast to the ugly scene. Lily stood frozen, not in fear, but in a strange, cold clarity. The destruction of the locket was not an end, but a beginning. It was a confession more honest than any words could ever be. The heated argument had scorched away the last pretense of civility, and in the smoldering aftermath, Lily's resolve hardened into something unbreakable. She would find the truth, no matter how many locks she had to break or how many ghosts she had to wake. The memory surfaced not as a clear picture, but as a ghost of a sensation. The smooth, worn wood of her mother's old writing desk beneath her small fingers, the click of a hidden panel giving way to a dark, secret space. It was a memory from a time when the world was warm and safe, a game her mother had played with her. The desk now sat in a shadowed corner of the living room, an elegant piece of furniture that Alina tolerated but never used, its surface holding only a decorative vase and a thin layer of dust. In the wake of the shattered locket, the house was a tomb of silent recriminations, but that faint childhood memory was a flare in the darkness, a direct line to the past Alina was so desperate to destroy. Late that night, when the house was steeped in a deep, watchful quiet, Lily crept downstairs. The moon was a sliver of bone in the sky, offering little light, so she moved by touch and memory, her bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. The desk stood sentinel in the gloom, its mahogany surface gleaming dully. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs as she knelt before it, her fingers tracing the intricate carvings along the side, searching for the almost imperceptible scene her mother had shown her so long ago. For a terrifying moment, she found nothing, the wood smooth and unyielding. Had she imagined it? Was it just a child's fantasy? Then her thumbnail caught on a tiny, invisible ridge. She pressed, her breath held. There was a soft, definitive click. A small, rectangular panel on the side of the desk sprang open no more than an inch, revealing a darkness within. A puff of air, smelling of old paper and cedar, escaped into the room. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against cold, smooth metal. She carefully drew out a small, tarnished silver box, no larger than a book. It was plain, unadorned, but it felt immeasurably heavy in her hands, as if it contained not just objects, but the weight of years of silence. Clutching the box to her chest, she stole back to her room, locking the door behind her. She placed it on her bed, the moonlight now her only companion. The clasp was stiff with age, but it yielded to her persistent fingers. Lifting the lid was like opening a long-sealed tomb. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and beneath them, a small, leather-bound journal. The cover of the journal was soft, the color of dried blood, and embossed with the initials S.E.M. Sarah Alina Morgan, her mother's maiden name. She untied the ribbon first. The letters were from her father, David, written in his familiar, looping script. They were love letters, filled with the ardent, hopeful words of a young man deeply in love. He wrote of their future, the life they would build, of how Sarah's laughter was the only music he ever needed to hear. They were beautiful, poignant, and they painted a picture of a love so pure it made the coldness of her current home feel like a cruel parody. But it was the diary that held the real truth. She opened it carefully, the pages brittle and yellowed at the edges. Sarah's handwriting was elegant and flowing, a stark contrast to the turmoil the words described. The early entries were joyful, filled with sketches of wedding dresses and anecdotes about David's charming clumsiness. Alina was a constant presence, her dearest Ellie, her confidant, her sister in all but blood. They shared everything from clothes to dreams. Then the tone began to shift. A subtle tension crept into the prose. She wrote of Alina's growing quietness, a new distance in her eyes when she looked at David. "It feels as though a shadow has fallen between us," Sarah wrote, "and I cannot find its source." The entries revealed Sarah's conflicted heart. Her deep, abiding love for David was a constant, bright sun, but her confusion and sorrow over the growing rift with Alina were a creeping frost, threatening to blight her happiness. She sensed a longing in Alina, a yearning for the life Sarah was building, and it pained her. "I would give her the world if I could," one entry read, "but I cannot give him to her, and I fear that is the only thing she truly wants." The final entries before a several-month gap were the most heartbreaking. They spoke of a terrible argument, words spoken that could never be taken back. The friendship was fractured, the sisterhood broken. The last sentence Lily read that night was etched in a shaky hand, the ink slightly blurred as if by a tear. "The fire has gone out between us, and I do not know how we shall ever survive the cold." Lily closed the diary, her own cheeks wet. She had found more than just secrets. She had found her mother's heart, a heart full of love, torn apart by a betrayal she never fully understood, all pointing toward the tragic, fiery event that had ultimately claimed her. The hidden box had not just given her clues, it had given her a voice from the grave, and it was begging her to listen to the rest of its story. The diary felt like a living thing in Lily's hands, a fragile paper heart that still beat with the echoes of a life cut short. The pale morning light filtered through her window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air like forgotten spirits. She had slept little, the ghost of her mother's conflicted words haunting the space between wakefulness and dreams. The story of a deep friendship soured by a hidden longing for the same man was tragic, but it felt incomplete, a prelude to a far greater cataclysm. With a trembling breath, she opened the journal once more, turning past the entries filled with wedding plans and whispered fears, to the pages that followed the several-month gap. The handwriting here was different, not just shaky, but frantic, a desperate scrawl that spoke of smoke and terror. The entry was dated, a day forever seared into the hidden history of her family. Sarah wrote of a party, a desperate attempt at reconciliation at the old Victorian house on Elm Street. Alina had reached out, suggesting they meet in the place that held their happiest memories, a final effort to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. David had been away on business. Sarah had gone alone, taking her baby daughter, Lily, with her. The words painted a scene of strained politeness, of two women trying to navigate the wreckage of their sisterhood. Amidst the familiar, beloved surroundings of Alina's family home, then the narrative twisted into a nightmare. It started with the smell, Sarah wrote, the acrid tang of smoke that seemed to seep from the very walls. Then the distant, terrifying crackle, panic. The frantic rush through hallways suddenly choked with thick black clouds. They were trapped on the second floor, the main staircase already a roaring inferno. In the chaos, Sarah's primary concern was her baby, swaddled and clutched tightly to her chest. Alina, in a moment of stunning selflessness, had tried to lead them to a back servant staircase, a forgotten route she remembered from their childhood explorations. But a falling beam, superheated and splintering, crashed down, blocking their path and sealing Sarah in a corner of a burning bedroom. The prose became fragmented, a series of desperate impressions. The blistering heat, the baby's cries, the sight of Alina on the other side of the fiery barrier. Mask of horror and determination. She was screaming, her voice raw, trying to find another way through. But the flames were everywhere, a ravenous living wall. It was then that Sarah described the most profound, heartbreaking decision of her life. Knowing she was trapped, seeing no escape for herself, she acted with a clarity born of ultimate love. She unwrapped her shawl, bundled her infant daughter securely within it, and with a final strength born of despair, she handed the precious bundle through a gap in the fiery debris to Alina. "Take her," the diary entry read, the words seeming to bleed from the page. "Take my Lily, keep her safe, tell her I loved her, tell her I love her still." It was a plea, a command, and a final goodbye all in one. Alina, her own clothes smoldering, her arms scorched, took the child. Their eyes met for one last, searing moment across the divide of flame, a moment of forgiveness, of understanding, of a love that transcended their broken friendship. Then Alina turned and fled toward the promise of safety, carrying the future in her arms, while Sarah remained, succumbing to the smoke and the embrace of the fire that had already consumed their past. Lily sat frozen, the diary slipping from her numb fingers to land softly on her quilt. The coldness of the house, Alina's harshness, her father's neglect, it all collapsed into a new, terrible, and radiant understanding. Alina had not been a villain, she had been a savior, a woman who had carried the weight of a dying woman's last wish from a burning building. The guilt she had carried for years was not for a betrayal she committed, but for the one life she could not save. Her harsh treatment of Lily was not born of hatred, but of a misplaced, agonizing penance. Every time she looked at Lily, she did not see a nuisance. She saw the living, breathing reminder of the friend she had failed to pull from the flames, the child she had saved while its mother perished. The shocking, Revelation was not one of malice, but of a sacrifice so immense it had twisted the survivor into a ghost, forever haunted by the fire she had escaped. The truth was no longer a ghost in the shadows. It was a living, breathing entity that filled Lily's room, its weight both crushing and liberating. She sat for a long time after closing the diary, the phantom scent of smoke and the echo of her mother's final, selfless act clinging to her. The coldness that had defined her life for so long was not a void, but a monument to a grief so profound it had frozen two people in its icy grip. Leaner's harshness and David's neglect were not the cause of the family's pain, but its symptoms. They were both trapped in that burning room, and Lily finally held the key to set them free. She found her father in his study, hunched over a spreadsheet, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his tired eyes. He looked up as she entered, offering a distracted, weary smile that no longer made her feel invisible, but instead filled her with a fierce, protective sorrow. She did not speak. She simply walked to his desk and placed the small, leather-bound diary in the center of his keyboard. He stared at it, his expression shifting from confusion to a dawning, horrified recognition. His face paled, his fingers hovering over the cover as if it were red-hot. Lily then went to find Alina. She was in the garden, brutally deadheading roses, her movements jerky and angry, a performance of normalcy that was as fragile as glass. Lily stood before her, the afternoon sun warm on her back, a stark contrast to the chill emanating from the woman who had raised her. She spoke quietly, her voice steady, telling Alina that she knew. She knew about the fire, about the desperate handoff through the flames, about Sarah's final words. She did not accuse, she simply laid the truth bare between them, a bridge built from ash and memory. For a moment, nothing happened. Alina remained frozen, a pair of pruning shears suspended in midair. Then a tremor ran through her. It started in her hands and spread through her entire body, a seismic release of 16 years of pent-up agony. The shears clattered to the stone path. Her rigid posture collapsed in on itself, and a raw, guttural sob tore from her throat, a sound of such pure, unvarnished pain that it seemed to rip the very air. She sank to her knees among the thorny stems, her face buried in her dirty hands, her shoulders shaking with the force of her weeping. The confession poured out of her then, not in coherent sentences, but in ragged, broken fragments. The guilt, the endless, looping nightmare of the flames, the weight of the baby in her arms, and the sight of Sarah's face disappearing behind a wall of fire. She confessed to seeing Lily not as a daughter, but as a living judgment, a daily reminder of her failure, her survivor's guilt curdling into a bitterness she could not control. David had emerged from the house, drawn by the sounds of anguish. He stood in the doorway, the diary clutched in his hand, his face a canvas of stunned disbelief. He watched the woman he had married, the woman he thought he knew, shatter into a million pieces before him. As Alina's torrent of grief laid bare the real story, the scales fell from his eyes. He saw with devastating clarity how his own retreat into work, his own refusal to confront the past, had been a form of abandonment. He had left Alina to drown alone in her ocean of guilt, and in doing so, he had left his daughter to freeze in the resulting emotional tundra. The family's strife was not Alina's creation alone. It was a shared failure, a fortress of silence they had built together, brick by painful brick. He walked slowly into the garden and knelt beside his weeping wife, his own eyes bright with unshed tears. He did not try to stop her crying. He simply placed a hand on her shuddering back, a silent acknowledgement of a burden she should never have. Carried alone, in that sun-drenched garden, surrounded by the scent of roses and the echoes of a long-ago tragedy, the three of them finally grasped the full, terrible depth of Alina's hidden burden. It was not a burden of malice, but of love and loss so immense it had distorted everything in its path. The confrontation was over. The truth, agonizing and beautiful, was finally out, and in its harsh, revealing light, the long winter in their hearts began at last to thaw. The silence that settled over the house in the days that followed was of a different quality altogether. It was not the brittle, watchful quiet of old, fraught with unspoken accusations and the chill of withheld affection. This new silence was soft, contemplative, a gentle exhale after years of holding a breath no one knew they were keeping. The air itself seemed lighter, the morning sun finding its way into corners that had long been steeped in shadow, warming the polished wood floors and glinting off picture frames that no longer felt like artifacts from a forbidden history. Alina's transformation was the most profound, a seismic shift in the very atmosphere of the home. The morning after the confrontation in the garden, she did not retreat behind her newspaper fortress. Instead, she was already in the kitchen when Lily came down, her movements less rigid, her posture softened by a new and visible exhaustion. As Lily hesitated in the doorway, Alina turned. Her eyes, usually so guarded, were red-rimmed and vulnerable, but they held Lily's gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was husky from the tears of the previous day, but the sharp edge was gone, replaced by a quiet, sincere remorse. She apologized not for a single incident, but for all of it, for the coldness, the harsh words, the years of emotional distance. The words were simple, unadorned by justification, and they hung in the air between them, a bridge meticulously built over a chasm of misunderstanding. From that day on, her actions followed her words with a deliberate, aching tenderness. She began to show kindness in small, tangible ways. A second helping of breakfast offered without a critical glance. A mug of hot chocolate left on Lily's desk on a rainy afternoon just because. She started asking questions, real questions, about Lily's day, her friends, her thoughts on a book she was reading, listening to the answers with a focus that felt like a form of reverence. It was as if she was seeing Lily for the first time, not as a ghost or a judgment, but as a young woman, her mother's daughter, a person worthy of love in her own right. The harsh lines of her face began to smooth, replaced by the gentle weariness of someone who has finally laid down a crushing weight. David, too, emerged from the fog of his own neglect. The shock of the diary's contents and the raw sight of Alina's breakdown had jolted him into the present. He started coming home from the office earlier, his briefcase often left unopened. He traded his distracted end-of-day greetings for genuine engagement, suggesting they watch a movie together or go for a walk in the fading evening light. He began to remember the small details, a test Lily had been worried about, a friend she hadn't seen in a while, and he asked about them, his interest a warm, steady presence. He and Alina began to talk in low, earnest tones in the living room after Lily had gone to bed, not with the frantic whispers of conspirators, but with the quiet, rebuilding cadence of partners rediscovering each other after a long and difficult journey. The family was not magically healed. The scars of the past were too deep for that, but they were healing. The process was slow and careful, like the cautious unfurling of a flower after a long frost. They began to share meals that were no longer performances, but opportunities for tentative connection. Laughter, a sound that had been a stranger in the house for years, occasionally bubbled up, startling in its brightness. Before it was warmly welcomed. For Lily, the closure she found was not a neat, tidy ending, but a profound understanding. She looked at Alina and no longer saw a wicked stepmother from a fairy tale, but a tragically flawed, deeply grieving woman who had loved her mother and had, in the most terrible of circumstances, saved her life. She looked at her father and saw not a man who didn't care, but one who had been lost in his own maze of grief. She understood now that love and loss were not separate entities, but were often woven together in a complex, painful tapestry. The love her mother had for her was the reason she was alive. The love Alina had for Sarah was the reason for her years of guilt. The love David had for them both was the reason for his profound sorrow. It was all connected, a messy human knot of emotion that could not be easily untangled, only accepted. One evening, as she sat on the porch steps watching the stars emerge in a lavender sky, she felt a sense of peace settle over her, quiet and sure. The past would always be a part of her, a story of fire and ice, of sacrifice and survival, but it no longer defined her. The cold house was finally warm, the ghosts had been given their names, and the future, for the first time, felt not like something to be endured, but like a wide, open road waiting to be walked, bathed in the gentle, forgiving light of a new beginning.